In the past episodes, we've covered disappearances that left behind mystery, confusion, and sometimes the rare relief of survival. But not every disappearance ends with someone coming home. This next case also began with disappearance. A child was gone, a family had expectations, and the world did not know her name until it was already far too late. Caylee Anthony was missing for roughly 31 days before police were called. And even after she was found, the truth never fully caught up. This is not just the story of a trial, it is the tragedy of Caylee Anthony. For 31 days, a 2-year-old child was missing. There was no nationwide search, no public panic. There were no official statements on anyone who disappeared, just silence. Her name was Caylee Anthony. Caylee Marie Anthony was a cute and bubbly little girl from Orlando, Florida. She was born on August 9, 2005. She was the daughter of Casey Anthony and the grandchild of George and Cindy Anthony. Unfortunately, on July 15, 2008, on a 911 call, she was reported missing by her grandmother, Cindy Anthony. How can a child possibly vanish for a month before the world is told she is gone? Before the incident, the headlines, the trial, and the unanswered questions, Caylee Anthony was a child. She was a little girl whose life should have continued beyond the court exhibits, the interviews, and the endless debates about what happened or who was guilty. And this may be one of the painful truths of the case. The world learned Caylee's name because she disappeared. And even after the authorities found her remains, the attention mostly shifted away from her and toward everyone surrounding her. Everyone talked about Casey's unbothered and unmothering behavior. The people debated about the jury's verdict. The public questioned whether justice was upheld. But Caylee herself was still at the center of it all. Her tragic story leaves people with more questions than answers. Not just because the case is so convoluted, but also because something emotionally unbearable remains unsolved. How can a child vanish for weeks before her disappearance has come to the surface? And how can the people closest to her become the very individuals in question? And how can the public feel so certain while the courtroom still demands proof beyond reasonable doubt? I believe this is why or where Caylee's story still haunts us. Not because outrage is unjustifiable, it is. But unfortunately, outrage alone cannot bring her back. Outrage alone cannot tell us what exactly happened. And outrage alone cannot repair the failure that allowed her disappearance to become an exhibit before it became a memorial. Caylee Anthony's story matters because it reminds us how quickly a child can be buried twice. Once in death, and again beneath the noise of everybody else's story. So perhaps the most respectful way to remember her is not to turn her into a mystery symbol, but to remember that before this case shocked the world, before the news headlines arrived, before everyone else demanded answers, there was this little girl whose life mattered completely. And even when justice feels incomplete, our memory of Caylee's story should not be. Before this case became famous on a national scale, there was a household. Just a family home in Orlando, Florida, where her mother, Caylee Anthony, lived together with her grandparents, Cindy and George. On paper, it may have looked practical. A young mother living with her parents while raising a child may not be unusual. And these types of family setups can be loving, functional, and deeply supportive. But shared space can also magnify pressure that many cannot see. Reports and testimony surrounding the case described a family system marked by dependency and conflict. Caylee was living with her parents and appears to have relied on the household for housing and practical support. Numerous accounts have described that Cindy played a significant caregiving role to her grandchild Caylee. This kind of arrangement provides support. However, it can also blur roles, meaning who must act the role of a parent to whom? Who makes the rules? Who should carry responsibility for what? Who gets to decide on certain decisions? When boundaries become unclear, tension often follows. Cindy was publicly seen as outspoken, proactive, and deeply involved in family matters, while George was often publicly portrayed as more reserved and often silent. On the other hand, before the case became national news, testimony and reporting described Caylee as someone who at times gave false explanations, struggled with stability, and maintained a normal outward image even when deeper problems may have existed. You may be wondering why I'm saying this. My point is, families under public scrutiny often become simplified into characters in a story. Even so, real people are usually more complicated than what the headlines show. Also, one pattern appears to be repeated. That conflict inside the Anthony home did not always become a resolution or something that arrived into a resolution. It often became denial, avoidance, argument, or competing version of events. Like in many households, this kind of pattern can go on for years. In turn, these ordinary homes can become fragile systems. Which brings me to say that many people may imagine tragedy as arriving from somewhere unknown, dramatic, or monstrous. But more often than not, it sometimes begins in familiar rooms, in kitchens, in bedrooms, in conversations no one finishes, in tensions everyone learns to live around. By this, what I mean is many tragedies begin in ordinary spaces. On June 16, 2008, Caylee Anthony was last known to be seen alive, according to the prosecutors and later case timelines. What happened next would become one of the most haunting elements of the entire case, not only because a child was missing, but because the clock kept moving while no official alarm was raised. One day passed, then several, then a week. By day 7, there had been no missing child report to law enforcement, no statewide alert, no public search. For a 2-year-old child, time is not neutral. Time is evidence. Time is an opportunity. But it can also become a loss. By day 14, the silence had stretched into something harder to understand. Family members gave differing accounts about what they were told and when they became concerned. Caylee Anthony would claim Caylee had been taken by a nanny named Zenaida Gonzalez, a story investigators later said could not be substantiated. Outside observers would ask the same question many still ask now. How does a toddler go unseen for 2 weeks without authorities being called? Inside homes under strain, however, people do not always respond rationally. Some delay out of denial, some freeze in panic, some trust explanations they should challenge. Some fear what truth might bring, and sometimes dysfunction itself becomes a kind of paralysis. Fast forward came day 31. On July 15, 2008, Caylee Anthony contacted 911, reporting that Caylee had been missing for weeks and saying Caylee's car smelled like there's been a body in the damn car. A call that would echo across the nation. Only then did the case fully enter official hands. That 30-day gap would shape everything that followed. The public outrage, the investigation, the courtroom battle, and the enduring question at the heart of the case. Was this denial? Panic? Family dysfunction? Or concealment? The legal system could outweigh evidence, but the delay itself became its own kind of evidence in the court of public memory. When the case became known to the public in July 2008, many people expected the familiar image of a desperate mother searching for her missing child. Contrary to that painted image, another narrative quickly emerged, one that shocked the nation and would heavily shape how Caylee Anthony would be seen long before a verdict was reached. During the 31 days Caylee was unreported missing, witnesses later testified that Caylee had been out partying at bars and clubs, spending time with friends. Reporting from the trial also noted that on July 2, 2008, she got a tattoo reading Bella Vita, an Italian word meaning beautiful life. Your child is missing, and you get a tattoo that has a meaning beautiful life? And wait, there's more. A tattoo artist later testified she appeared upbeat and happy during the appointment. Multiple friends also described her demeanor during that period as outwardly normal, calm, and cheerful. To much of the public, that behavior felt incomprehensible or nonsensical. Whenever someone's behavior falls outside a script that people deem as normal, people naturally interpret it harshly, well, sometimes instantly. I find this hard to accept, but behavior alone is not automatic proof of homicide, nor does outward behavior always reveal inward truth. Because people can be under stress and dissociate, deny, compartmentalize, behave bizarrely, mask distress, or behave in ways that might confuse everyone around them. But still, perception still matters. And in this case, the lack of visible urgency became one of the strongest forces in public judgment. For many watching, the question stopped being what happened to Caylee and became what kind of mother acts like this while her child is missing. That shift would define the cultural memory of the case for years, turning demeanor into evidence in the court of public opinion, even as the legal court would have required something very different and concrete, which is proof. At first, it was the nanny. When law enforcement began asking where Caylee was, Caylee Anthony said she had left her daughter with a babysitter named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez at the Sawgrass Apartments. She led officers there, but the apartment was vacant, and investigators were unable to verify the childcare story as she described it. That explanation which had bought time inside the family, began collapsing the moment it met the outside world. Then, it was the job. Casey also told investigators she worked at the Universal Studios Orlando. Detectives accompanied her to the property while trying to verify information connected to the search. After leading them through the complex, she eventually admitted she did not work there. It was a dramatic moment because it showed investigators something larger than one false statement. They were chasing narratives instead of facts, while a child was still missing. Then, it became where Caylee was. Who had seen her? Who had called? What happened next? Prosecutors later charged Casey with multiple counts of providing false information to law enforcement during the missing person investigation. In 2013, a Florida appellate court upheld 2 convictions tied to false statements given during the investigation. Those documented falsehoods included claims involving employment, childcare arrangements, and Caylee's whereabouts. Every lie damaged credibility. That matters because trust is often the first currency investigators need in a missing child case. Once trust collapses, even truth struggles to be believed. And if a person finally says something real after many falsehoods, the tragedy is that no one knows whether to run toward it or away from it. By December of 2008, the search had changed. What began as a missing child's case had become something heavier and harder to speak aloud. Near the Anthony home in Orlando, in a wooded area off Suburban Drive, human remains were discovered. The place was painfully close to where Caylee once lived. Detectives later confirmed through DNA testing that the remains were indeed Caylee Anthony. The remains were found with bags and other material described in records and reporting as trash bags or bagging associated with the scene. Duct tape was also documented in association with the remains, becoming one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. Some child-related items, including a blanket often as a Winnie the Pooh blanket, were also identified near the scene. However, the passage of time had already taken something detectives could never fully recover, which is clarity. This is because the remains were already in an advanced state of decomposition. And because of that, the medical examiner was able to classify the manner of death as homicide, but the cause of death could not be determined with certainty. Which brings me one understanding of this case. A body can tell us many things. It can reveal that a life had ended. It tells us that it can also reveal concealment. And it can also expose neglect or violence. But somehow, a body cannot answer the one important question everyone asks. How? Maybe this is one of the deepest wounds of the case. The remains found confirmed Caylee's death, but it could not clearly explain how it arrived to it. When the prosecutors built their case against Caylee Anthony, they did not bring the jury a simple story with one clear piece of proof. They brought a pattern of deception, a pattern of delay, a pattern of behavior they argued pointed toward guilt. They reminded jurors that Caylee gave false statements to the investigators about a nanny, about where Caylee was, and about employment at Universal Studios. She was ultimately convicted on counts of providing false information to law enforcement during the missing child investigation. For prosecutors, those lies were not side issues, they were central. Their argument was simple. Innocent people may panic, but repeated deception during a child's disappearance can suggest knowledge of something being hidden. Then there was the timeline. Caylee was not reported missing for about 31 days. Prosecutors treated that gap as deeply suspicious. They also pointed out to testimony from Cindy and George that Casey's car trunk carried a strong odor they believe resembled decomposition. Investigators and expert witnesses later debated forensic findings connected to the trunk, including air sample analysis and hair evidence. Prosecutors also pointed to how Caylee's remains were found in a wooded area near the family home, with bags and duct tape associated with the scene, arguing these were indicators of concealment and unlawful disposal. Taken together, prosecutors argued this showed consciousness of guilt, lies, delay, strange conduct, and efforts to hide what happened. It was a powerful emotional narrative, and for many watching, it felt convincing. However, courts do not convict feelings, they convict proof. Sad to say that much of the case was circumstantial. That doesn't mean weak or meaningless. Circumstantial evidence can be strong and valid. But in this trial, jurors later said they struggled with one core problem. They could not say with certainty how Caylee died, who caused it, and whether the state had proven murder beyond a reasonable doubt. That is what made this case so harrowing, because many people saw guilt. Unfortunately, the law saw doubt. This is the part many people struggle with, because courts and public opinion may often ask different questions. A jury does not ask, "Is this suspicious? Does this look bad? Would an innocent person act this way?" A jury asks one harder question. Or rather, they are obliged to ask a harder question. Was murder proven beyond a reasonable doubt? That standard is high on purpose. It exists because taking away a person's freedom, or in this case potentially imposing the death penalty, requires more than instinct. It requires evidence strong enough to survive doubt. In Caylee Anthony's trial, the jury heard evidence that many found troubling. 1. Caylee's lies to the police. 2. That 30-day delay. 3. The strange behavior during Caylee's disappearance. 4. The discovery of Caylee's remains near the family home. And the disputed forensic findings. None of that was irrelevant. Suspicion and behavior can matter. Circumstances can matter. But unfortunately, jurors also faced major gaps. The medical examiner ruled Caylee's death a homicide, yet the exact cause of death could not be determined because of advanced decomposition. Without a clear cause of death, the state had to rely heavily on inference. Additionally, there were also competing interpretations of key evidence. The prosecution argued concealment and intentional killing. The defense argued accidental drowning, followed by family panic and cover-up. Jurors did not have to believe the defense story completely. They only had to believe that reasonable doubt remained. And then, there was the burden itself. Circumstantial cases can absolutely lead to conviction. But when several core questions remain open, like how Caylee died, when she died, and whether the evidence proved Casey caused it intentionally, some jurors concluded the state had not crossed the legal line required for murder. That is the painful divide at the heart of this case. Because suspicion can be powerful, and behavior can be powerful indicators of guilt. Circumstance can be heavily considered, but proof must be stronger. The public often asks what feels true, but the jury must decide what was proven. By the time the trial began, Caylee Anthony's name was known everywhere, but something painful had happened. The story was no longer centered on a child. It had shifted to Caylee Anthony, to courtroom clashes, to nightly outrage, to endless debates over guilt and innocence, to a media spectacle so large it sometimes swallowed the reason it existed in the first place. Millions watched, millions argued, millions chose sides. And in the middle of all that noise was Caylee. She was discussed through exhibit numbers, forensic terms, witness statements, timelines, trunk odor debates, duct tape arguments, and legal strategy. Those things mattered because they were part of the search for justice. They were the language a courtroom uses when trying to answer tragedy. But behind every exhibit was a little girl, a child who may have wanted to become a princess, a child who may have dreamed of going to Disneyland next year, a child whose world should have been made of cartoons, birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and ordinary joys. Instead, her life was translated into evidence. I just want to be clear that I'm not rejecting due process. But I guess that I'm grieving for the fact that the legal process required so much from Caylee. Yet, it could not fully give back. There was no clear cause of death, and the person responsible was not convicted. And yes, while many believe Casey looked guilty, looking guilty is not the same as being proven guilty. That distinction protects innocent people, but in this case, it also left many feeling that Caylee remained unheard. And I believe that is where this case leaves a lasting ache. Because after all of that, the process still could not clearly tell the world how she died, or who was legally proven responsible for taking her life. She disappeared once, physically. Then again, inside the noise. We remembered the defendant. We remembered the verdict, the outrage. Because sometimes, when a child becomes famous only through tragedy, society risks honoring the spectacle more than the life that was lost. Some cases do more than ask what happened. They ask who we are when we watch it happen. The death of Caylee Anthony became a national obsession not only because it involved tragedy, but because it touched something deep in the public mind. People saw Caylee Anthony's behavior, the lies, the delay, the socializing, the calm demeanor, and many turned those actions into certainty. That reaction is human. We often use behavior as a shortcut to truth. When actions violate what we expect from a grieving parent, people do not simply judge the behavior. They often infer guilt from it. But behavior, while meaningful, is not always the same as proof. The media understood that tension immediately. Conflict attracts attention. Outrage keeps attention. Nuance rarely trends the same way. Coverage of the Caylee Anthony case became constant and highly emotional, with major networks, tabloids, and social media turning the trial into one of the earliest modern trial-by-media spectacles. Research and commentators later noted how the case became a public drama long before jurors reached a verdict. The case also exposed something quieter and more common. Family dysfunction can hide danger in ordinary homes. When people inside a household lie to one another, excuse warning signs, avoid conflict, or protect appearances, truth becomes harder to see. And when the truth erodes inside a family, crisis can grow unnoticed until it is too late. I believe this lesson matters far beyond this case. And finally, it revealed the limits of justice itself. Courts are built to decide charges. They test evidence, weigh credibility, and apply legal standards like reasonable doubt. But courts do not always deliver complete truth, emotional closure, or a story that satisfies the public. In this case, the jury acquitted Caylee Anthony of murder while convicting her of lying to law enforcement. For many, that verdict felt unresolved, because sometimes a courtroom can answer the legal question, yet leave the human questions open. That may be why this case still lingers, because it was never only about one family. It was also about how we judge, how we watch, and how we fail to notice, and how truth can remain unfinished even after a trial ends. On day 31, the world learned Caylee Anthony's name, but only because something had already gone terribly wrong. People did not meet her through a birthday party, a first day of school, or the ordinary milestones that should introduce a child to the world. They met her through absence, through fear, through a question no family should ever have to ask. Years later, many still debate the adults, the lies, the verdict, the outrage, who looked guilty, who failed, who should have paid. But beneath every argument was a child who never got to grow up. Caylee was not meant to become evidence. She was meant to become a person. She was meant to become older than 2, to have favorite songs that change every month, to outgrow old shoes, to ask impossible questions, to dream new dreams each year. And she is not alone. Across many cases, children are remembered not only for who they were, but for how they were found. Their names become attached to exhibits, forensic terms, timelines, and headlines. The details of their death become clearer in public memory than the shape of their lives. Sometimes justice comes late. Sometimes it never feels complete. Sometimes truth remains broken into pieces no court can fully put back together. And when that happens, memory becomes its own duty. To remember them not as mysteries, not as content, not as symbols, but as children whose futures were taken before they could speak for themselves. Because the final loss is not only death, it is being remembered more for the crime than for the life. How many forgotten children live in public memory only as evidence, when they should have been remembered for the lives they never got to finish?